Well, thanks to all of you for sticking around for this final wrap-up session. I just wanted to start by first acknowledging everybody that's helped make this happen. So I'll start with our AV crew at the back, Courtney and her team, who have really helped make things go seamlessly. And Pamela, Tara, Pamela, who's been here since like 6 o'clock in the morning every day to help make sure breakfast is here and everything else is organized. And Tara, who you've all probably gotten emails from. And for all of you who are students and got travel support or early career and travel support, you've probably interacted with Alex and will be interacting with her. So we should thank her as well. And Jessica and Omar and Jennifer and Aisha. So thank you. Thanks to all of them for helping make this happen. And then thank you to the organizing committee, which has been really helpful. So Radley, Mingfang, Nathan, Andrew, James, Chris Ebai, Katie Mock. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Vishan, who is online with us. So yeah, thanks to everyone for actually bringing this to fruition. And thanks to everyone who helped out with the whole workshop. When we are here, especially with the people that help with the City College workshops, so Valentina, Yana, Sanketa, again, B. They really helped kind of broaden the outreach of this workshop, and all the students and moderators who help with the breakout sessions. So let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. And then thanks to all of you for being so engaged and being willing to communicate and hear people from outside of your disciplines. That was really something we wanted to make happen. I know for some of you, I made a request to last minute make some changes to your presentations, and I appreciate all of you that did that. So thank you, and thanks for everyone to be really engaged with each other. That's just hearing all the conversations outside and just getting all that feedback from here. I feel like we have a better understanding, at least a little bit of a better understanding of each other's work and each other's disciplines. So that's really been helpful. I want to again acknowledge our the funding from NSF that really helped bring so many early career students and postdocs and researchers here. We were able to support over 30 early career people. And actually, some of the senior faculty commented on that there's so many early career people here, and that's been just so fantastic. Because I feel, I think in some ways it's a reflection of many of us who are here because we're really committed to helping communities manage climate risks, and many of us are here because we really care about that, and also are interested in doing interdisciplinary work. So. It's been really nice to have so many people that are early in their careers here. And with that, I don't want to take up any more time. Let's get, we had 5 breakout rooms, so we'll just go around and just hear some reflections from everybody. And then we can have just sort of an open discussion. Oh, Pamela. Oh my God, yes. And we hope you get some sleep. Thank you.
Go downstairs on your way out, and please drop off your name tags on your way out. All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So we'll start with Nathan with the team that he was moderating. So you should be able to just same thing. Your slides.
Thanks to Noel and Avian for excellent note-taking and reflections. So we had a lot of really good conversations, and just thinking about the first day, we sort of reflected on this idea that there is really been a shift in science and also science communication related to climate change. Like, so much in the past was focused on convincing people that climate change was real, and then all of a sudden, like, society moved, well, a good chunk of society moved past that, not everyone. And now, the scientific community needs to reorient to be more solutions-oriented. So how do you do that? How to make science more operational and solutions-oriented. We discussed that it's really hard to do very detailed studies everywhere, and yet maybe that's what the community members or practitioners would really like to have. So maybe what's somewhere in between? Are there like heuristics, guidelines, or tools for heat-related solutions to help policymakers and decision makers? So maybe you don't do a detailed modeling study about changes in urban canopy everywhere, but maybe if we know, for example, that the benefits of a tree in a neighborhood with X amount of impervious surface is 2x the benefit in a more forested area or something, that kind of stuff could be helpful. And then we also discussed tailoring communications to different audiences and how elected officials, maybe they're looking at a headline and 3 bullet points or something, and we'd need to be able to distill to that. So on day 2, we were also talking about the gap between our physical understanding and maybe like societal's collective understanding about extreme risk, like the extremes, and just where we might be headed, and do people fully understand that, and how to communicate that as things sort of rapidly evolve. And then we also talked about enhancing understanding and also reducing vulnerability by kind of meeting people where they're at. And I think Kathy had a very similar point in her presentation earlier. But whether it's like maybe we shouldn't close the libraries down if they're like a really valuable, cool spot in a city. Not throwing money at one thing, but then reducing or forgetting about assets that we already have, or thinking about the subways, or communicating with faith-based organizations or things like that. And then we also discussed emphasis on like variability and vulnerability. Obviously, it had sort of a North American bias here, but just reflecting on the large differences between low and middle income countries and maybe higher income countries. And, maybe one silver lining is that heat waves occasionally do shed light on that differential vulnerability and bring attention to the issue. So, thanks.
All right, so thanks to Trinesh and Chris Callahan for taking notes for those of us who were in the auditorium and attempted to have an engaging breakout discussion in this format of a room, which I think we did. So yeah, I guess as you can see, sort of starting off with, we were discussing the challenges, and there's many others, but I think 2 of the ones that were maybe more interesting that we talked about. First of all, we kind of reflected on the day 1 presentations, highlighting the root causes of impacts being largely things that are related to the structure of society, essentially, and especially ones that maybe a lot of us hadn't really thought about, like some of the regulatory or legal aspects and how those play out. And then also kind of relevant to both impacts and hazards, people are just using different definitions, and that kind of scatter the understanding in a way that is, I guess, not insurmountable, right? There are ways that we can improve our definitions of impacts and hazards. Various things that we talked about then in terms of solutions to some of these challenges. We talked a lot about community-based and maybe microclimate specific understanding and forecasts and messaging. We were a bit taken, I guess, by this idea about like different sides of the street and different levels of a building. And again, maybe you could develop like a heuristic, if you live on the upper floor of a south-facing exposure, you're going to be at risk in this event, whereas other people might not be, that kind of thing. This idea that maybe a more roundtable approach, and I guess going off of what was just said about like libraries and assets we already have in general, like just to take New York City or another kind of world city like Hong Kong, for example, they have all these departments and agencies and so on, and then there's different levels of government, but like in New York, are they really talking to each other in a way that is kind of conducive to synthesis, especially if you're faced with things like COVID, compound hazards? Maybe these agencies are just kind of zeroed in on a particular message and not sort of thinking about how the overall messaging is coming across. And the parenthetical there is, the point is made that in Hong Kong, they learned a lot from the experience of SARS in 2003. And they seem to be applying that sort of practice to their heat wave risk. And then modeling potential interventions is maybe something that physical scientists can do to help. And science needs, I'll try to speed up a little bit. We talked a little bit about if someone goes to a cooling center, how long do they need to be there to like meaningfully reduce their risk before they go back outside, that kind of thing. Maybe ecosystem impacts are a bit understudied, and then also, of course, like the value of nature on society maybe is underappreciated, and heat wave damages to that. Extreme heat, like along the coast, also could be studied more. And then, in terms of the second day, super extremes, compounding impacts, compound hazards are very nonlinear. There's a bit of discussion about heat and wildfire smoke, and then that kind of encapsulates actually many of these different other challenges. We talked about social trust, personnel shortages. There are things like, not enough doctors in places. So we sort of know that, but people aren't maybe doing enough about it. And if there's a heat wave, that's going to illuminate that problem. And then there's other things like COVID. And, certain people like farm workers, delivery people are, again, just very unequally affected. Then we were talking about how other disasters, pretty much every other disaster, I guess that's a natural disaster, are like you can get better pictures of them. They damage property. They damage property. And so things like insurance or federal disaster declarations tend to be more keyed to that kind of thing. And heat, of course, kills people in some cases, but maybe the more, also an important point is that it might have quite subtle and corrosive effects on things like educational attainment, in low-income communities, long-term health impacts and stuff that are harder to measure but seem quite important, and then community-level understanding. Anyway, so in terms of the solution space, obviously climate financing might be a major lever there. It needs to really be keyed to local needs and values. Social and community capital, like the examples from Vancouver and many others, seems like something that can maybe solve many problems. Like people feel comfortable because the community is relatively safe and they can like open their windows and not use as much AC, that kind of thing, and not checking in on each other, all that. And then finally, we discussed a bit this idea of like last mile vulnerable populations. So like even if you have a good set of, even if you understand the microclimate and you get some warnings out there, if the actual people who are most vulnerable are not either receiving those warnings or acting on those warnings, then a large part of the job remains undone. Thanks.
Okay, so up in 315, we, in the first day, for whatever reason, ended up talking a lot about heat and health, just based on the interests of who was in the room and who started talking early. I think we had some things we wanted to get to and ran out of time. So even starting off at the very beginning of the day, we were asked, we heard an anecdote about, it's like, congratulations, climate science has solved the first mission of sort of showing that climate change is real and it affects things, and now moving, as others have said, towards a solution space. And these are frankly really hard questions to try to answer. One of the things that there was a lot of interest in asking about was the ways in which the drivers of vulnerability to heat. And we heard about physiology, we heard about different kinds of social and community and behavioral practices, and also infrastructure. We also heard about impact beyond mortality. And a quote that someone made is, it's not the climate data that's the weak link, it's the data on the human data, or sort of, if we're trying to look at impacts on people, it's figuring out, what can go into those models. So as an example, I think, I would have looked, if I was trying to study impacts on mortality, I would have gone and looked naively at data sets that talk about mortality. But we heard from our physician who was with us that these data sets have huge caveats. Many users may not understand them. Things like people will die from heat, but it'll get coded as something else. It's often coded by people who don't have relevant expertise. So on day 2, then again, the conversation shifted and focused a lot on communication and applications. We started off the day again with a really inspiring story, and sort of a question about how can we reduce human suffering in times of extreme heat. I think one of the themes that came out was that there's a lot of interest, not just downscaling climate information, like a very top-down approach, but really trying to scale up, and especially for solutions. So as we're looking at solutions, there are so many, we heard in the morning panel, there's so many communities that are trying different things to adapt to climate change, but a real challenge is that something might work in one place, another community will perhaps not have a way to assess whether that might work there. Or maybe there's models that say that will likely work there, but then there's a trust and sort of response issue there. And so finding ways both to sort of screen what might work in a particular place and to rapidly pilot, figure out what works, discard the things that don't. And then sort of talked a lot about, there are lots of really important insights from climate science for many of the sectors that are affected by extreme heat. But a lot of the actionable decision support requires getting pretty deeply embedded. So, for example, we heard from Con Ed that if a weather model on timescale of a week or so is predicting that a tropical cyclone might be followed by a humid heat wave, the contracts they would sign with different line crews that they hire might be different. They might plan to have them for longer. Or if the forecast is that another city will be impacted, they might try to hire them for a shorter time so that they can go where they're needed. And similarly, that this sort of getting back to this idea of being deeply embedded is that users will often ask for something because they're trying to ask, but actually giving them what they initially ask for versus listening deeply and trying to figure out what problem they're solving, and then trying to give them things that we can answer that address their needs can be challenging. So that wraps up what we talked about. I wanted to end with sort of my own 2 cents on what we talked about. So again, there was a lot of interest in thinking about how to design and scale up solutions. And I think a particular challenge is that in many of these different sectors, there's a need for climate science, but a lot of what's needed is not answering hypotheses about the fundamental nature of the Earth system. And that this is a real challenge for researchers and people in academia who are trying to square this with getting research funding, publishing in scientific journals, tenure and promotion, and that doing all of these things, we need to find, and I certainly don't have any solutions here, but trying to find ways to square that. So thanks to everyone and to our note takers.
Okay, I just wanted to say that for the people that are like far behind, you're welcome to come in the front so we can have a more intimate discussion. So yeah, feel free to come forward. Okay, I'm gonna advance the slides for V. V, let me know.
Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. We can't
All
see
right.
the slides though.
The slides no more though. Okay, should I share
So
my screen?
maybe if you want to share the screen, because I can see the slides here, but like not up there.
Sorry to make things complicated, everybody.
Yeah,
Okay,
go ahead.
some slides. All right. So, sorry I can't be there in person with you all, and it really sucks because I miss you all already. But I had a really nice time at this workshop, and we had a really popping group in Team 301. So first off, I want to shout out the wonderful student note takers that we had, Lene and Sam, and then also Andrew and Zach for holding it down and having facilitating a great discussion. So the first day, we talked about first some of the stuff about what we know. There's many physical scientists in the room, so we started off the discussion with basically the physics and the science of heat waves. So some of the dynamical and thermodynamic drivers of heat waves, how they're related to Rossby waves, high pressure systems in the atmosphere, and sinking air. And then also the thermodynamic aspects, the association with clear skies, enhanced radiation, soil moisture deficits, and then ultimately some feedbacks. We all came to the conclusion that it's very important that we need to consider humidity as well. And I think the stickiness of the whole experience really motivated that. And then also, this came up a lot during the workshop, those in impoverished, marginalized, and destabilized communities slash regions are affected the worst, unfortunately. And then with regards to projections of the future, it seems like extreme heat will probably most certainly get worse in a warming climate. That's something we have a little uncertainty about compared to other extremes. So another thing we talked about is the definition of heat waves. I guess at first we were going back and forth about there's all these definitions of heat waves, but at the end of the day, we all get alerts on our phones about if there's a heat warning. So it seems like we have a good grasp of what's a heat wave and what's not. So we also spoke about some of the challenges and the gaps. And one big thing that came up was the fact that, okay, we kept talking over and over again about how impoverished and marginalized communities are affected the worst. But in our scientific spaces, we don't see a lot of representation from these communities within the spaces themselves. So there really needs to be more that's done in terms of recruitment, mentorship, that kind of thing. However, I would say that this has been a very diverse workshop, one of the most diverse ones I've been to. And then also the outreach that we did with the high school students on Monday and Tuesday gives me a lot of good hope in addressing this issue. So another challenge that came up was the distrust of vulnerable communities to science and the government, especially in marginalized communities. Sometimes they don't want to listen to what elected officials are telling them. Rightfully so, I think, in some cases. Other things that came up were energy grid demands in the near and far future, the effects on the yield of different crops, how to best adapt and mitigate now and near the far future. So, it seems like climate change is already here and these heat waves are already wreaking havoc. So what can we do now, but then how can we plan for the future? And another topic that came up was the most practical way of considering humidity. You have all these different metrics, wet bulb temperature, wet bulb globe temperature. There's a new stickiness one that came out recently. All these metrics, but which one is the most practical one? And then some other big ones were bridging the schisms between research and practice and implementation and everyday people. We have all this jargon, all these acronyms, but it's hard to really communicate that to everyday people for them to take action to protect themselves. And this lends itself to language barriers. And then also health implications came up where we were thinking about Medicare and Medicaid. And I think Andrew will jump in next, right?
All right, I will jump in. So go through this, catch up. So I was a sort of a last-minute player to be named later sort of deal. So I came in on day 2 and facilitated this. So I've not synthesized this maybe quite as effectively as some of the others, but we focused on really 2 questions in this group. We started with the unexpected risks and kind of the worst case scenario because we thought it would be a more interesting and lively discussion, and it was. So a few things came up, more sustained events, right? This is something that we know. We talked quite a bit about compound events. And one of the things that came up was the interaction with non-climate related events. So somebody suggested, solar flares, right, which we had a couple of weeks ago. If a solar flare would have knocked out power and then you get a heat wave, right? Rather than just stacking weather, you could have some non-weather events that are coming into play. Interactions between different kinds of drivers, perhaps playing out on maybe some longer scales. So interactions between heat, drought, and global conflict. Food security would be wrapped up in there. We had, I think, very much in mind the current situation in Houston of, again, kind of a compound event, right? Storm knocks out power, and now you're dealing with a heat wave without the usual strategies that exist in that place to deal with heat. We also talked about ecosystem implications, both on land and in the ocean. And so echoing what one of the previous groups was talking about. Crime as sort of other kind of socio-behavioral events. So thinking about how heat can influence crime, accidents, injuries. Perhaps some of these could stack up in some novel ways. And then one other kind of interesting sciencey bit that came up was that, I think especially after CMIP6 came out, there was a lot of discussion about how some of the models had very high climate sensitivity. I will suspect many of us are wondering, are we living in a high climate sensitivity world this summer, right? Or over the last year. So have we maybe thrown out useful information in studies that have filtered some of those high sensitivity models out? Okay, and then we talked a bit about solutions, and these are not like matched up one-to-one across things. So we're just thinking about what could you do to prepare for some of these worst case things. So we talked quite a bit about weatherization. I thought a really interesting one about activating local NGOs, especially some that might not be currently active in or think of themselves as having a role in sort of climate and weather events, could be important resources for communities. And so there may be opportunities for doing some training and outreach with those groups. Similarly, health providers, social workers, home healthcare providers, people who may be going into people's homes or having very intimate discussions with them could be a very good kind of set of trusted messengers. Talked quite a bit about regulations for outdoor work, how we really need to think about that space. We did talk a bit about kind of things that would be around community resilience. So, for example, we talked on the unexpected risk side, we did talk a bit about kind of food security and a power outage, right? You can lose your refrigeration. Suddenly you're out with, quite a bit of the food that you purchased, or in other cases, you may have a drought that would lead to more of a longer term challenge. But, should we be thinking about, food banking in cities? And then similarly, should we be electricity banking, right? Are microgrids and storage an opportunity? And then this was one of my favorite, was prioritizing electricity, sort of recognizing that like right now, anybody who plugs in has essentially the same access to the electrons as everybody else, but yeah, exactly. We had that discussion too, but yes. And actually we amended it. It was like kill I, except for downscaling. We thought maybe some machine learning downscaling could be useful, but things that we use the grid for that might not be deriving the same social value as like keeping people alive, right? Like mining Bitcoins. And then finally, we had another interesting discussion that was around, integrating cooling, efficiency, housing policy, rent control. A lot of this was motivated by Stefan, who was telling us about Germany, and so I'll characterize that as be like Germany. Probably won't work, in the U.S. just for various reasons, cultural, socio-political, political reasons. But there were some interesting examples in other countries where issues are getting tied together, and there may be some opportunities for that here. So, thank you.
Hi, everyone. So this group was actually led by Kathy Dello, but she had to fly back to North Carolina. And so me and Yana here were the two note takers. And I was basically tasked / volunteered to present or report out. So we talked about quite a few things like the other groups too. We started off on day one by talking about some of the aspects of heat that are not completely understood. Talked about, the impacts of humidity on the human body, and this was touched on this morning a lot too. Impacts to infrastructure, and also we kind of realized that sometimes it's not even really about the weather or climatic factors that are the real problem. It's other societal factors, right? So no matter what heat index you use or whatever index of heat you use, if we fix some of the societal problems, it'll get us to a much better place than focusing on those actual physical indicators. We then talked about how, in what ways are we increasing our knowledge of extreme events? Increasing our knowledge in general. And we thought one way we're doing that is by understanding extreme events more. And that's just because of their nature. They're very much headline grabbing. For example, the June 2021 heat wave, through its dramatic nature, it really made us focus in on sort of how extreme can a mid-latitude heat wave get, for example. Another way we're improving is through getting down to smaller spatial scales, and also through more computational power. We can just crunch more data to hopefully enhance our knowledge. We also had some caveats, discussed some caveats. For example, in the third bullet point here, a better or more fine resolution spatial scale doesn't always mean better for end users. One example of this is that, for an incoming heat wave, the decision making doesn't need to be at the street level, right? It can be a general forecast for the city that temperatures will be hot for the next 3, 4, 5 days. And that's really as fine scale of a warning as you need for that city. Another somewhat related, but perhaps not so much related sort of thought that we had here was that sometimes, when we think about what is our logical next research step, we might know what that is, but we might have 10 other issues which are sort of more pressing. And so sometimes we feel like we can't get to the next logical thing we need to do just because of other obligations, both research-wise and other sort of job-related obligations. And again, I apologize a little bit for the sort of scattered nature of these notes. They're kind of like tying together a larger list of bullet points. The final note we have here from day one is how it's important to listen to your end users. Typically, people we talk to, so think stakeholders, policymakers, they're savvy and they know their problems, they understand what their problems are, and they don't need us to tell them what their issues are. It's more about us listening and trying to figure out how we can best address their issues. This is my first time doing this. Nope. Yes. Okay. So moving on to day two. We started off day two by basically asking each other, what are some things which keep us up at night, that worry us as climate scientists? And we went through quite a few sort of things on this subject. We just listed some of them here. For example, the big heat wave in India at the end of May came up when temperatures hit 50 Celsius in New Delhi. That's obviously very stressful for the population there. We talked about loss of power during heat waves, like what we're seeing in Houston right now. In general, damage to infrastructure, but also things like social isolation. If we have to sort of spend more time indoors because it's so hot outside, that's not necessarily ideal too. We would lose time outside. Also touched on sort of the dire future projections, especially towards the end of the 21st century, and some stuff about the physical nature of, for example, heat waves. We had some discussions about sort of the underappreciated role of upstream latent heating in enhancing sort of mid-latitude heat waves through diabatic heating. Talked about that. I'll quickly kind of go through the rest of these. Again, talked about sort of many entangled social inequities which get compounded during heat waves. And if you fix those, you can sort of naturally, organically build better climate resilience. Talked about how there are definite policy tweaks which could be made. For example, and I didn't know this going in, but I learned in this discussion that some states, for example, New York, have policies where if you are a utility, you can't shut off somebody's power during a cold wave, right? Can't leave them without heat, for example. And it would be, I guess, ideal if we would have similar protections where even if you, let's say, can't afford your power bill, a utility can't turn off your power during a heat wave, so you don't have AC, right? That should not be legal. And just some more general notes. I'll just touch on the last one. We also really discussed how it's not just about sort of dire future projections out to the year 2050 or 2100. You know, what about the potential for highly disruptive black swan type events that might happen this decade, might happen this year, next year, that perhaps we're underestimating the risk of? So that's what I have. Thanks for listening.
I don't want to take up too much more time, but we also had a group of people online who had a discussion, and many of the points were actually covered by what we've talked about here. But I'll just mention a couple things that weren't covered in these breakouts. Apologies if I missed it. But one of the things that came up here was around the idea of predictions and improving our predictions. There's I guess even our understanding of how like natural variability modes can influence extreme events. Our understanding of that is pretty limited, I would say. There's not enough research, especially with all the metrics that we have for extreme heat. Understanding how these things like ENSO could affect it are not very well understood. So there's some research gaps there. The questions around developing heat wave early warning systems, and people need that not just a couple of days in advance. People need more time, so having longer-term predictions would be useful. Having longer-term predictions for multiple variables, daytime, nighttime temperatures, many of the other indices that we've talked about are important. But also, should those models be predicting indoor temperature as well? Like, can we start to go from just daytime, nighttime temperatures to what people might be experiencing inside the building? And so, yeah, basically, they've written need to include inside building temperatures and predictions. And then thinking about our solutions, we did hear a little bit about this from Jane, where she mentioned our adaptations to heat, dry heat might be different than our adaptations to humid heat. And so that's also mentioned here, that some of our technological solutions may not be, they might be insufficient when we're talking about really hot and humid conditions. There's also something about geoengineering here. Not enough knowledge of whether geoengineering would be a viable tool or not, and I think we could have probably a whole other conference to discuss that. And yeah, I guess providing locally relevant knowledge, which has come up here quite a bit. So yeah, I think many of the other points have been covered here. I just wanted to kind of touch on two things real quick, and I want to then turn the mic over to everybody else. So first, I wanted to mention that we've talked a lot about, we've heard a lot about how we're not experiencing heat equally. There are many communities in the US and in North America, and many communities we've heard about that are experiencing disproportionately higher impacts. One of the things we didn't hear about are the impacts on indigenous communities. And they are a population that here in the US that are, in the US and as well as elsewhere in the world, that are extremely vulnerable to all the impacts that we've talked about. And I think there's also challenges in generating knowledge on the impacts to those communities. So that's something we should think about as well. And I really appreciate that Rachel, Julia, and Peter all acknowledged the lands of the indigenous people. And I apologize, we did not do that at the beginning of this meeting. We should have done that. And so I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that we're on the Columbia University is on the land of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wapinker peoples. It's important to acknowledge that and acknowledge the injustices that have been done and hope our work can serve those communities in the future. And then you might have also noticed that a lot of our discussions here were around impacts in North America. Largely, we did hear about global impacts, and that global research is sort of, to some extent, easier to do if you're looking at the atmosphere and large-scale circulations like some of us do. But some of these really local impacts, they require local knowledge, local regional scales, and it would be great to actually hear from what's happening in other parts of the world. We would have loved to learn more about, there are places that are much hotter than here, and we tend to think of, I guess sometimes we tend to think of people in other countries being very vulnerable, which they absolutely are, but they're also, their livelihood, their lives depend on, being outside in many cases, and they're much more exposed. And so they're not just sitting there experiencing the impacts. There are a lot of innovative solutions that are coming out of those regions. And I can, I'm from India, and that's just having spent some time there, just seeing that, the ways in which people are identifying solutions, it's important to learn from those regions. And I wish we had the opportunity to hear more about the research from there. And part of it is just funding constraints. We didn't have a whole lot of money to put this together. And it's sort of hard to do in a smaller workshop format, but I hope we can do that in the next time we're here. And I also want to acknowledge just issues that we had. We had actually several people that were going to be coming from other parts of the world, and it was just visa issues that prevented them from getting here. And that's an issue that has come up quite a bit in the scientific community, in the global scientific community, that people from the global south are experiencing challenges in attending conferences, attending meetings internationally, and building their network. And I hope we can get better at doing that. So with that, I'll turn it over to our other organizers if there's anything y'all want to add. Otherwise, we can start this open discussion. So we just wanted to hear from all of you about what are some big takeaways from you from this workshop? Anything that y'all want to share? Yeah, please. Yeah, you don't have to wait here. Just come forward to the mics. We have both the mics are working, so please go ahead.
Really fast because I have to leave in 5 minutes. So I'm Caitlin Flanagan. I'm from the National Geospatial Intelligence. I'm also really short. Okay. From the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I'm a human geographer focused on climate security. I'm also a spatial demographer. And so something that I found problematic in this conference is that the vulnerable population and vulnerable communities have not been really examined, have been used interchangeably. And these are terminologies that mean very distinct things for me. So I think what's been interesting listening to this conference is listening how heat is exacerbating social inequalities that are extant, true. So using those social vulnerability indices is okay, but it's not, I think, exploring how heat is creating new types of vulnerabilities that are intersectional and multiscalar. And so I'm going to just give you a hypothetical person to think about how you might address this, like a 65-year-old man with a heart condition who lives in a house that he can afford to cool effectively in a community that's subject to rolling blackouts in a town that has a really good resilience plan. That's not an unheard of thing, but in the ways that we've been talking about that this week, there would be no easy way to categorize this person or think about an intervention. And just so you know, a lot of my work is focused on humanitarian assistance and disaster response, both domestically and globally. So that's kind of the space I'm coming from. So just thinking more critically about what those mean. And then when we talked about know your audience, that's me. I'm going to be using all your stuff. So just how would you tell me, and at what scale, to take your research, because kind of throwing vulnerable communities at the end of a project is less than useful in this world of practitioner that I live in. Yep.
Hi, thank you. Briefly, Deepti, I wanted to sort of tag on to what you said toward the end about the importance of the Global South. And I also was hoping to see a bit more in terms of how we're thinking about heat waves there, because it looks very different in a hemisphere that has more water than the northern hemisphere. And if we're thinking about extreme heat and humidity at the same time, there's a lot to be learned from the Global South in that perspective. And I also wanted to, as I think about sort of what the practitioners have identified and what the global climate community has identified in terms of where they're at, I think there are opportunities to begin to bring that global climate knowledge down to the scales that the local practitioners are wanting. And so I'll put out a brief call to continue to do your work, but to connect more and more with a couple of different sub-niches of urban climatology and the biometeorology world. So biometeorology is just weather and climate impacts on people, plants, and animals. And that's basically what a lot of us do here, even if we don't directly touch those individuals. And so those are great communities that don't necessarily have the expertise that you guys have in the global climate modeling space. And there's a lot of synergy that could be happening there. And within the biomet world, I also sit in the space of being the chair of a new students and new professionals group. And we're actually trying to better understand our work in biometeorology in the Global South. So if you have knowledge in there, please come talk to me. We're trying to do more and are organizing a workshop ourselves in that space. So thank you.
Yeah, some of this conversation reminds me of, I don't know how many of you were at AGU and how many of you were at AGU? Did any of you go to Amitav Ghosh's talk? And it was really interesting because at his talk, he mentioned there was this big heat wave in India, and there's people are surprised that more people didn't die. I wish that was not our expectation, but the point he was trying to make was that, we think of wet bulb temperature as being really important, and there were days when there was really high wet bulb temperature in India, and people didn't die, but they did die during dry heat. And so I think as scientists, we think wet bulb temperature is really important. It may not be, and also understanding the context in which it's happening and the ways in which people are responding is useful in thinking about impacts. Anyone else want to add anything here? Any other takeaways?
I just want to add one thing, I'm doing physical drivers. I thought that was complicated. I was naive. I see urban planning use very limited data with so many uncertainties, but still have to make decisions that really just directly related to people. So I will do better and better on my physical drivers and try to make it easier for urban planning people to use all my outcomes.
Hello, everyone. It's really nice being here. First, I'd like to thank the conference organizer. I think it's a really wonderful opportunity for us to meet each other, discuss the hot topics, and also exchange our ideas. Actually, I want to mention, probably point out one missing element in those kind of presentations and talks. We saw so many presentations and talks talk about regional model, global model, but you can see that from the service and service provider end or end user, they really need this kind of at least urban level or even community level. So that means the urban climate, this kind of research, it seems missing. And also, I take a role as a chief editor of Journal of Urban Climate. I would like to welcome you submit the high quality papers to our journal. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a couple of comments online. So the first one is from Abhishek Srivastava from UC Davis. He says, I'm a climate scientist and I've learned much about the multiple dimensions of heat, impact, adaptation, and vulnerability. One thing that I learned is that impacts analysis is extremely difficult considering the human, social, behavioral, economic, and political aspects. However, realizing the limitations and understanding the challenges ahead indicates that we're on the right track. It's a very positive note. Thank you. And then there's one more. One other comment is that whilst physical sciences are really important in order to implement solutions, I think we need to give a voice, a much stronger voice, to social scientists and urban experts to help us overcome the multiple barriers and gaps. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hi. I'm just thinking how to say it. There are many takeaways from my standpoint. As I was saying, I'm a physician, so I'm definitely biased by that. To me, it's incredible to be here and really learn from the big pictures and how you're analyzing and doing all these heavy work to understand the climate. In the initiative of having interdisciplinary disciplines here, I think that's a big area of opportunity for us to bring expertise, not in that big picture only, but to have more representation at the regional level, as they were saying, like in the South, in other countries, as well as people doing other kind of work at the community level. Again, the healthcare providers, I'm surprised how we are not here. And I'm not saying this is a lack of invitation or lack of interest from our end, but I think there is a lot to learn from one another because climate, this is one of the conversations we were having earlier. Which journals are we going to be submitting our research? Which audiences we want them to read, right? Am I trying to create awareness on climate on healthcare providers, or am I trying to tell, climate experts about conditions? There is not a particular niche, yet I think climate is influencing every single discipline, right? So I think that these represent a great area of opportunities to bring more people to the table and have these discussions and apply all these amazing knowledge, but also develop collaborations to understand and predict and project at the community level by that specific population needs. In the end, all these guidelines, and we know what the climate is projecting, but how much of that is going to be useful if that's going to become a guideline and really we're not doing some actionable things. So I think we're missing that part. Thank you, though.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think it's really important for us to have spaces like this. Usually most of the conferences, when I go to AGU, I sort of tend to stick in my lane, but I'm obviously very interested in just learning about the impacts. It makes me think differently about the research I do as a climate scientist so that I can think about how that can be usable. So yeah, it's been really helpful to learn from everyone here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Debanjana, and it has been fantastic to have the interdisciplinary knowledge, no doubt. But again, it's also helped me to realize again and again how important to have a very solid storytelling for the bigger audience and how to connect them. The storytelling is very, very important. That's another. And another thing, most of the research showings the vulnerable communities, right? I work with students from the back colleges and the tribal colleges. Sometimes they are within that vulnerable situations, but they are not aware of it. So communications with that group and engage them in this kind of research and the conversations, we need more on that space. And I'm from Calcutta, India, and it's really challenging situation there. But at the same time, when the heat wave comes, I have personally experienced, so there are a lot of challenges. But on the other hand, there are a lot of, I will say, hopeful, social infrastructures. During the heat days, you can sitting in your house and your neighboring some grocery places, they deliver the food next to you. And also you don't have to walk 1 block or 2 block to get some minimum day-to-day jobs. They have a lot of, their urban planning is not greatly designed, but at the same times, during those times, I think elderly people can be taken care with more care than here. So it's a challenge, but I think there are a lot of positive things also in the global south in community level trust and care. That's the point. Yeah,
that's an important point, and I think it came up, I think, on the first day in the panel where someone said like people need to watch out for each other, and that's something in some of the heat warnings and heat communication. There isn't that much that says go check on your neighbor. In fact, I guess from Portland, I'm from Portland, and their recent communication has actually said that. They said, like, check on your neighbors, monitor yourself, monitor others. But we don't see that as much. And again, this is something going back to thinking about Amitav Ghosh's talk at AGU. He said this. He said maybe the reason we have so many deaths in Western countries from heat, especially the elderly, is likely because there isn't that same social fabric that's where people check in on each other and take care of the elders. And in some of the other from the global south, I actually don't like that term, so I'm gonna stop trying to use it. But from other countries, from more developing countries, there is much, like, the elderly people live with their families. So if they are experiencing health challenges, that can they have people to help them out. So yeah, that's an important point. Thanks for liking that. Yeah, I'm gonna go to the next question for discussion, which is, what are some gaps and opportunities for developing actionable health research? We've heard a lot of solutions, but yeah, I just want to hear if you have any other takeaways.
Hey folks, thanks again to the organizers for doing this. I think this is a great...
Oh.
Do I have to twist it? Awesome, there we go. This is much more on the gaps and challenges side than it's also an opportunity though, which is just a plea for greater support for interdisciplinary research. I think this is it's both a challenge and an opportunity, but I think as someone who tries to be on both sides of the sort of physical climate and socioeconomic impact side of things, I think there is a real lack of things like field journals to publish in, funding opportunities by major funding agencies. There are more conferences like this, so this is really encouraging. I think this is a place where we're clearly starting to make progress on this, but I think there are a lot of ways in which the scientific infrastructure is not fully developed for the kind of fully integrated interdisciplinary research that I think would be really exciting and be able to push these kinds of things forward. And so I've seen this in the job market context, for example, like there are hiring processes that don't necessarily kind of reckon with that interdisciplinarity. And so I think there's work we can do not only in meetings like this, but on all the other sort of parts of the scientific infrastructure, journals, hiring, funding, et cetera, that I think would make this research a lot more feasible for working scientists to do.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm not trying to complain. This is a great meeting. So thanks everyone for being here.
I have the same complaint, so no worries there. I just wanted to mention, someone else at the workshop mentioned that there's support for community engaged research, but if like physical scientists want to do that, there aren't funds to actually develop those community partnerships before you want to do community engaged research. So that is a barrier that I think that funding agencies should also try to address. Nikosi?
Yeah, this was arguably one of my favorite conferences or workshops that I've ever been to, just because I get to nerd out about heat with everybody. I think it's also very obvious that after these past 3 days of talks, like honestly, after a certain point, we probably could have skipped all of our introductions because we knew what we were going to talk about. We all know what heat is, right? I think one of the more interesting talks that I heard was about the actual solutions and testing the solutions. So seeing if we put tree canopy in a certain place, what does that do? What does shading in a certain neighborhood do, right? And this goes for myself too, because I was talking a lot about the drivers with land surface temperature and what causes it to stay elevated and things like that. Well, what do we actually do to stop, the surface from heating more? What do we do in certain places? In Miami, can we use certain tree canopies? If not, because, they may evapotranspirate more and continue to make the environment more humid. So I think testing these actual solutions and running those into models and things like that is something that would literally convince somebody, okay, well, we know that putting a tree here is going to help this. Why aren't we doing it, And then also from a standpoint, advising local politicians and policymakers, if we literally put that right in front of them, it's like, okay, well, if you're denying it, then that's your issue, That's just my frustration with politics sometimes. But yeah, I think that's the easy way to solve those issues, and I think we can do that as a heat research community.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk this morning too, that's testing all these different solutions. I think it also highlighted one thing where we can't just think of one risk. We have to be thinking about compound risk, because from what I remember from that talk, it's also mentioning that certain solutions can actually help reduce heat, but might actually reduce dispersion, so might result in the accumulation of pollutants.
My comments basically tag on the previous two comments to some extent. Someone mentioned infrastructure for community-engaged research. That has to be external funding, journals. It has to be internal at the university level too. I'm on the tenure track. There's no outreach checkbox on my tenure promotion, evaluation, right? So hopefully the university gets it together and puts it in there by the time I go up for tenure. Fingers crossed. But that needs to start happening, right? And there, in some places it happens. Universities that have agricultural extension, do a really good job often of putting those type of activities as part of the evaluation and incentivize faculty to do that kind of stuff. On the science side, and I'll also reference that talk from this morning, we as a community are very used to developing tools, parametrizations, models that are curiosity driven. We don't often develop tools in conjunction with the community. And that might be important when we're trying to evaluate solutions. Are we including the right parameters in our models in ways that communities can play around and have the levers that they can push and pull on? And I think that's a big gap right now in our modeling suites, especially modeling suites where I'm involved with is on more on urban scales. We do a little bit, they talk about trees and pedestrian comfort, but can you imagine someone in an urban planning in Westchester County going in and running urban WARF with the X and Y parameterization? That's a big ask, right? And do they have even the right tools to even plug into what needs to be run there? I think that's a really, really big gap that we need to address and include perhaps those communities in our development process.
Thanks. Just a quick note about tenure. I think a lot of that relies actually on the community, because your peers are going to be writing letters for you, and so I think it's also maybe a call for the community to think about what we value as scientists, and acknowledging that some of the work that we have agreed that needs to be done doesn't happen on the timelines of getting tenure, and we should acknowledge that and not just push for publications and more publications that nobody reads or very few people read, but rather value the kind of impact that you're having.
So this has been a very informative 3 days. And I would say some of the things that the research that talked about compounding, one of the things that might have been helpful for those is a financial collaboration in terms of what the fiscal impact may be. A lot of cities and localities, they don't have the resources to continuously do research. So if they see the vulnerability that's being created because they don't have enough resources for these compound events, or even the impact on the beyond the infrastructure, I think that would have been, could, and it still is practically extremely helpful. And I think including the fiscal part as well. And also thinking about, this is not new, but it's ongoing. So if there's a way to keep updating the research, because things are going to be changing every year. But climate, how do we keep getting more information so that decision makers can have what they need in order to make changes or do bonds? And I think the last thing is, there are many cities that have disappeared because of heat. In South Texas, they're disappearing because of the compound events combined with the heat. So it might be extremely helpful to lawmakers to know what are some of the key indicators, or what are some of the things that happen right before those cities aren't able to, people chose to move and they don't exist anymore.
Yeah, thanks for raising those really important points. We do have a few people that have looked at economic impacts, but I think Chris Callahan actually is one of the folks that's been doing some work on that, and I think Jeremy, who gave the last talk on the health session, was also talked a little bit about that. But yeah, I think your point is well taken for sure.
So I loved the focus on people at this meeting. Some of my best friends are people. But I would like to put a plug in that I think it would be really great to have some ecosystem science, some conservation, and some resource management here. Just to point out, birds do not have air conditioning, right? They have to deal with whatever nature is giving them. Yeah. And I think there's some really deep questions about things like what do elevated nighttime temperatures do to ecosystems, to ecosystem processes, to behavior, right? I think there's just a lot that we don't understand, and I think it'd be really fun to have that as part of the agenda.
Thanks, Andy. And you were on the organizing committee. Just kidding. But yeah, I will definitely consider that for next time. No? Oh, sorry. Were you? Okay.
I guess one thing that's coming up right now, as well as throughout these past few days, is the people on all, coming from all like disciplinary backgrounds are looking for more data, better information, and more information at higher spatial and temporal resolutions. And I agree that there are tons of gaps in our knowledge regarding, whether mortality is actually driven by heat and how difficult that is to, actually put a number on, wanting representation from the kind of physical and social side from the global south, or whatever you want to call countries that were colonized, I guess. But in the meantime, we are facing climate change and hazards that are kind of beyond our comprehension, and there is a need to make decisions in real time with imperfect data. And so I wonder if a future iteration of this conference, or just people who are interested in the kind of intersection of heat impacts decision making, could I guess make themselves more aware of like the literature regarding decision making under deep uncertainty, and like be it I think we could all maybe be making a bit more of an effort to like understand that literature ourselves and reach out to people who are out in the world trying to implement that, because unfortunately there's never going to be enough and perfect data to be able to make whatever decision. So it couldn't hurt to, I guess, start thinking about that right now.
Absolutely. Thanks for that.
Let's see if I can get this right. There we go. Oh, well, it just came off. That works too. Yeah, I guess I'm going to die on my soapbox today. I think people heard it when they came to my poster yesterday, but I thought it might be helpful to provide a different perspective. In like Miami a lot, we've been talking about the fact that heat is different than, an acute episodic heat wave event, that we just don't see those there in places like Miami. So we've been talking a lot about like chronic heat as an alternative term. And so it was just very interesting the last few days how that never really came up in discussion. Like we're very focused on the heat extremes, the heat waves, the anomalies, the spikes in temperatures, but to the point of like those countries that are low middle income countries, and then within like Miami, places along the Gulf, it's not really an episodic event. It's something that's happening every year, year after year. We know the heat's coming. It's going to last for many months on end. And so just really putting it out there to the research community to kind of rethink that framing, because it has a lot of impacts then to how we think about the solutions. How does that change vulnerability? So it's really a plug for my paper that I really just need to publish soon. It'll get there soon. But I think like it's just like an important framing that I think like we get so stuck on the, as Kathy mentioned, like the blockbuster events. But I think like the underlying kind of pervasive issues that are happening in these chronically hot places get overseen.
Yeah, we look forward to reading your paper, and the point is well taken. Yeah. There's one comment online by David Almanza. So it's I think it's worth keeping in mind that innovation is sometimes used in the context of urbanization, and that may impose certain assumptions when it comes to solution generation regarding rural lifestyles or even tribal indigenous spaces. I think it's important to question assumptions of development as akin to sustainability. Thanks. Okay, since we're almost 2:45. I'll get to the last question, and then I want to leave 10 minutes or so for our co-organizers to share any thoughts. So the next question is sort of like, what are some next steps that you'd like to see? We've talked a lot about things that are gaps in this conference, but maybe are there any reflections on what you all would like to see coming out of this? Maybe a smaller space, but you don't have to run down the steps.
Let me just hike down from up there. Hi, everyone. Lene. I went to a kind of similar workshop earlier last year, and I think one of the things that was really helpful as an early scientist was it was very focused on creating collaborations. And so, like, many of the sessions you had with the same people, and the intent was, like, come up with a crazy research idea, and you're probably never going to do it, but I think it started to get people talking and thinking about how they could integrate their expertise. And I feel like that would have been really cool here as well, because the people are in the room, and it just, I don't know, there's so many opportunities. I think we had the space in the coffee hours and the breakfasts and the lunch, but having that kind of organized spaces for it was really helpful. So would have loved to see something like that, and maybe in the future it can be incorporated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to hear more about how that was organized.
I think this maybe is a little different from that suggestion, but I think in terms of the potential for this to be like a rescheduled event in the future, kind of being cognizant of the time it's scheduled for like practitioners, I think a lot of, at least in the US context, practitioners are actively like working in the heat season right now, and it can be incredibly difficult to sort of leave those spaces to come to a conference space and collaborate with researchers and other practitioners. Obviously, this works on the academic schedule really well for like the summer. But I think if we're trying to sort of increase those collaborations with practitioners and really creating research that can be utilized in those spaces, just being aware of the timing and sort of like scheduling events like this so people can participate and have the capacity to participate as well.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, Andrew had brought that point up when we were thinking about organizing, and we just didn't get around to doing it in time. But yeah, maybe early spring would have been a better time. Peter?
Yeah, Peter Kalmus from NASA JPL. I would, so one thing I'd like to see, I think we're already, as a community, starting to do this really well. And I think it's really important to continue improving our ability to project mortality and morbidity. So to go from all the various wet bulb and humid heat metrics and to combine those with, downscale projections from the GCMs, but in a way that's kind of more informative than saying like, this is dangerous levels of heat and this is extremely dangerous. Like we could start to be like, people over 65 who are taking this medication probably shouldn't run a marathon on this day and that kind of stuff. So I think we're getting there, but we have a lot of steps to go. Then the other thing I'd like to say is, I feel like the elephant in the room here is kind of the fossil fuel industry. I always find it weird how I have to say that at extreme heat conferences because it never really comes up that much. We have to realize, I think we know this already, but we don't really hold a lot of space for it. This is not something that's happening. This is something that's being perpetrated on us, right? And if the fossil fuel industry has from the whole time, like from the beginning, been like honest partners, I wouldn't say that because then it's like all of us using the fossil fuels. But we know that it's very well documented that for decades they've been covering this up, they've been lying, they've been spreading disinformation. And there are lawyer activists out there who are trying to hold some of those executives and lobbyists accountable literally for murder, right? Which is, I think, kind of what this is. And I know that probably sounds kind of radical to you, a lot of you, but I think there's going to be a real shift over the next few years as extreme heat events get even worse, for that perspective to become more and more normalized, again, just because they've been bribing politicians, spreading disinformation in a very kind of coordinated, colluded, knowing way, just so they can make more profit. And so a next step that I'd like to see is for how this community can sort of come together and discuss ways that we can support the sort of global climate movement, which is trying to build power to go up against the fossil fuel industry. And I think like this sort of community could be a very valuable partner in that, just kind of bringing the information and, you know, kind of fighting against that disinformation and bringing credibility to the activists.
Thanks. For sure, I think with all of us could do better at communicating these risks. And I think one of the reasons we have this interdisciplinary workshop is so we can understand each other's disciplines better. And so when we are communicating about climate change to people that are voting or involved in other sort of decision making, that we're better at communicating the totality or the comprehensiveness of the risks that we're experiencing.
Yeah, I think building on that, I think community groups and the community as a scale of intervention came up a lot in this space. And yet I really did feel the absence of community groups in this space. I think like the nonprofit panels, like there was definitely a few representatives, but it felt there's a lot of heat work in New York with environmental justice organizations that felt like that really could have been like a space for engagement, especially because we are situated in New York. So maybe some more kind of place-based, like I know that there was work with like local high schools beforehand, but maybe some more kind of in placement. Also just thinking about like Harlem in relation to the rest of the city, like where we are specifically. And like also just around, you know, we're in this nice air-conditioned building and talking about extreme heat. And so I think that some of that, especially as we're talking about like the body scale and all of that, thinking about ourselves in relation to that would be nice. And I think also maybe some more kind of methodology interchange. Like I think that in 12 minutes, it's hard to explain why you chose a specific methodology to answer a specific question, but a lot of the physical methodologies were new to me. And so it would have been nice if there were maybe breakout rooms or spaces where you could get like a quick introduction to sort of why people are choosing the methods they're choosing for like, I definitely learned a lot about like why, you know, rapid attribution chooses the methods that they do and that kind of thing. So I think that that kind of space, almost like a little bit like crash course workshop for people that are not familiar, especially as we're trying to work across like quantitative, qualitative, different backgrounds would be really lovely.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we did actually try, I think maybe not hard enough, but we did try to get some of the more local organizations. I think part of it comes down to funding and, you know, paying people for the time that they're spending with us. And unfortunately, we did not have the resources to do that, but we'll certainly think about that. Okay, we're short on time, so quick notes.
Okay, so I'm wondering if we all community can put together some best practice for research adaptation and or knowledge sharing. So if we have such best practice and guidelines, then we can do research more efficiently. Sometimes I feel like for researchers, we are reinventing the wheels. So having some best practice recommendation and also open research practice would be great. Yeah.
All right, well, there's definitely something in the air because I was going to make a methodological, technical note as well, which is, you know, coming from the regional or global kind of climate modeling perspective, I think a lot of people, it's very easy to do, you know, CMIP analysis or whatever, because basically you can go download the data and everyone looks at more or less the same stuff. But to my knowledge, I'm kind of trying to get into urban climate stuff a little bit more. And to my knowledge, it's not it's a lot more scattershot. It's sort of like case studies. Everyone has to set up WRF on their own cluster. So it'd be great to try to like push for more organized test beds or something so that people can really dive into urban climate modeling without such a high technological barrier.
Yeah, thanks. Andrew?
As a climate scientist focused more on the ocean, I really enjoy this conference and enjoy the opportunity to be here, talk to all the social scientists, atmospheric scientists. I think one suggestion I have for the next step is you could probably increase the visibility of this conference to the ocean people, because definitely the coastal heat wave events is kind of a gapping area, and coastal cities are also vulnerable to the heat waves, the marine ecosystems, the fissures. So there's a lot of questions that hasn't been explored. So I would like to see more interactions between the atmospheric scientists and oceanographers. I would really excited about the future. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. Thanks a lot for organizing. One point I wanted to add is that communication was a big part of this workshop, and I think artists are great communicators. So I feel like bringing artists and finding ways on how hard scientists who are in this room can better collaborate with artists could be a greater opportunity to actually expand their translational opportunities for this work. And I know there is great work that's currently happening in the artistic community, in like developing comics or theater of the oppressed with communities to both communicate climate change but also develop solutions together. So,
thank you. Yeah, that's a really great idea. So one quick comment here, and then we can wrap up. Yeah.
So I will just will not talk about the challenge, but the 2-3 points. Like, I feel like it's a huge opportunity because all of us has a different background. If we can even put some of our knowledge into some pieces as a review paper or as a success and challenges, as a paper or as a report kind of thing. And number two, she just reminds me because I'm also an artist. So I feel like anybody in this group, if is a storyteller or the comic or a dancers or the performing, if any stories from the science presented here, if they can come up, I can help put them together too. And the third one, I learned from my old past conference that's organized not by any academic institute, but it was a great opportunity. They make a group after the conference how to write the proposal and build a team. And that actually helped 4 of us to get the Sloan grant. So I feel like if we can do that to help early career and also build the relationship with the senior experts. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one thing we will do after this is to make everyone's emails available and potentially even think about some sort of follow-up online meeting we could have. The talks will be online too. Just don't reply to the email I sent last night where I CC'd everybody, 350 people. So don't respond to that. But I will make everyone's information available so you can reach out to them. We do have everyone's expertise, and so if you are interested in connecting with somebody on the health side, you can find people through that database. We had 350 people registered for this conference, so a lot of different expertise here. Radley, Mingfang, do you want to say anything?
It was really a great experience for myself too. Even though I'm I was kind of part of the organizing committee. I think I wanted to bring out particularly thanks to Deepti here. She's the junior person leading this team. So yes. Yeah, a lot of the a lot of ideas in this workshop in terms of format and, the interdisciplinary group of organizers she brought in. Mostly it's her. So really, really great job doing it. And offsite, she's not at Columbia, but doing a lot of work. My reflection on the workshop is very similar to a lot of you. I'm a physical climate scientist. I was sitting here listening all these talks and panel discussion. I felt like this sounds like self-congratulatory, but it's like the best workshop I've attended. I learned so much from this only 3 day. And obviously, I know some of you mentioned that we're missing things. Yes, absolutely. We can do much more, much better next time. So one of the things I hope we can do, like Deepti said, we'll have sort of a communications contact list from everyone. So if you have any ideas, how can we continue this kind of workshop in the future? It's not very easy to put together something like this because funding is not always possible. I think we contacted lots and lots of funding agencies. Only NSF was able to fund us at the sort of early career scientist travel fund. That's the only thing. And then we got some local fund and through Radley some NOAA fund. But it's always difficult to come up with funding to support a workshop that is fully, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary kind of focus. And as in terms of the science side, I learned a lot, particularly in terms of the indoor heat. I was very interested because we certainly have the indoor requirement for cooling, right? In the wintertime, we don't have anything about summer heat. But research is also lacking in terms of what matters to indoor heat is different from outdoor. And then the other thing I learned is that it's, in terms of resolution, data resolution, it's actually what matters in terms of high resolution is more for evaluating the impact measures, the solution that we implement, less so perhaps for adaptation. And obviously it's important, but adaptation that can be applied to city level. But when you want to evaluate, is putting the, like we heard from the other day in the panel, putting a planted bench, how much that actually makes a difference, right? So we really need the street level data for that kind of thing. And a scale up, for adaptation is another thing that we need to pay a lot more attention. Even as a physical scientist, I feel like there are a lot of research that brought up in this conference that we can think about how we can tackle these problems. So I'll just leave it. And it was a great idea in terms of like a perspective paper from this workshop. We certainly will try, but we can't guarantee we'll get something done very quickly. But we'll try. Yeah.
So just a couple of quick things. In terms of the comments about sort of fossil fuels, disinformation, attribution, we actually are going to be convening a workshop November 14th and 15th here at Columbia about climate attribution and legal and policy dimensions of that. So we'll get that word out to everybody. It'll be a two-day workshop. Just a couple super quick reflections, a few other things I feel like really stuck with me. I'm not part of that group, this thing of like, it doesn't apply to me. And maybe that really hit when there was the slide this morning that was like, older people, 50 to 80. And I was like, that doesn't apply to me. But no, seriously. Elderly, right? So yeah, but I think in all seriousness, that is a thing, sort of the disconnect between sort of knowing you're in a group, but there's these psychology, sociology dimensions that are a big part of it. A couple other things. I think we saw progress in the space, but still, the impacts talks were so great. That's such a robust dimension that's really coming together. Mostly still like fairly sectoral. I think there were exceptions. Certainly, we heard a lot about economic impacts across sectors, but I think for future work, further exploring the intersector dimensions and some of the cascading impacts. The sort of last takeaway, thinking back to some things that like Franco was saying on the panel about this applied work, actually, like working with people at the block level, and some of the things he was saying about, he put it a couple ways, like it's not just adaptation, it's not just mitigation, it's like social justice, sustainability, just building it all for the future. And then when he said, and the partnerships, the working together, empowered people, and pretty soon those same blocks are the ones where people are just more generally sort of actively talking about, ways they want to sort of build another world. So in terms of sort of active, just about everybody now who deserves to be thanked has been thanked. Deepti, as we heard, really the central role, a lot of ways. There's one person who deserves as much credit to, who hasn't been mentioned yet, Mingfang. This really was you. It was you and Deepti that made this happen. So to both of you, you were great. I think both of you. Yeah.
Radley, don't
Thanks to all of you.
underestimate your role, because you did as much. So thank you. So I think one more thing I'll say, I was thinking about whether to say it or not, but Colin and I have something in the pipeline around compound hazards and bringing more, different stakeholders and scientists in the same room. So if you're interested in learning more about that initiative, it's going to be focused on compound hazards and communities, and probably something next year. So if you want to learn more about that, either email me or call in or talk to us now, and we'll be happy to share what we're thinking. And again, please don't reply all to my email yesterday. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have safe travels back. And thanks to all of you for being so engaged.